Okay, so we're going to take it from chapter 3, page 6 here. Here we'll take it from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down at the period, if you could see that, at the end of the line. It says Vashoresh. You see that, Betzalel? Page 6, chapter Gimel, and down from this, the line starts. The line ends with the last 3 words. Vashoresh and Yana Klippa. So the root of the concept of Klippa, hu lehepech. It's the exact opposite of what we just said about kedusha. Hu bechinas pirud v'yizchalkus dafke. It represents separation. Separation itself is the concept of Klippa, right? Because what is Klippa? It's like a shell. And what is a shell? It delineates the thing inside the shell from everything that's around it. Right? So it wants to basically put things into separate categories and remove them from each other. V'uma she'amar Yaakov yeshli kol. Right? So we find that this is actually Rashi even brings this out in the Chumash, but it's like a striking, obvious hint of some higher philosophical concept inside of the words of the Chumash itself. When Yaakov and Esav are sort of having this little debate, right? Esav is ostensibly trying to kill Yaakov, and Yaakov brings him this tribute, this mincha, to try and persuade him to calm down. And they have this exchange. Yaakov says, "Take it, I have everything." Esav says, "No, you take it, I have a lot." Right? And this is the language they use. Yaakov says the words, "Yeshli kol," I have literally everything. Like, you take it, Yeshli kol. And the word kol is lashon his klalus. Kol represents an inter-inclusion of everybody. When you say everything, it means you have like a set where there's no pieces left behind. Right? Everything is internal. Everything that could be in existence, basically, right, is taken into account and unified inside of his worldview. Whereas Esav, Amar Yeshli Rav, right? Just one little word difference, but you can see their whole philosophy right in this one word. Where Esav says Yeshli Rav, he says, you take it, I have a lot. Lashon riboy v'piru. And what does a lot mean? The word a lot really comes to the word riboy, which means a multiplicity, which when you have a lot, no matter how much you have, it means there's stuff you don't have. Because your whole attitude is basically that the world is a bunch of separate things, which cannot really be like included inside of some simple unity and oneness. And so you're just grabbing pieces of sort of an infinite set, right? And so the idea, Yeshli Rab, is that he has a worldview of separation. And therefore all you could have is a lot, but not all. But Yaakov, and then there's another like sort of hint of this philosophical distinction between them, just in their short words that it says in the Torah. Yaakov hagam shahayu ayin nefesh, kesiv nefesh lashon Yaakov. When Yaakov goes down to Mitzrayim, it says shivim nefesh yardu Yaakov Mitzrayim. With 70 souls he went down to Mitzrayim. But the word for soul is actually nefesh. It says singular, right? V'hainu kanal. And why is this? Why is he has 70 people and he calls them one soul? For the same reason we said before, the Besitra de Kedusha, because on the side of holiness, Hagam Sheish Eser Sfiros, Gimel Sichlim, Zayin Midos. Where does this number come from, right? That there's 10 Sfiros. Welcome back, Levi.
Back to you.
Thank you. Here, I'm going to pass this along to Levi there. Even though in the side of holiness, you have 10, which is basically like a general number representing a multiplicity, and those 10 represent what we call the Gimel Sichlim, the 3 intellectual spheros, the Zayin Midos, the 7 emotional spheros. In fact, Ze Mispar Ayin Nefesh Yotze Yerech Yaakov, this is where the number 70 comes from. Yaakov represents like the pinnacle of Kedusha, of course. And why did he have 70 souls? Because those 70 souls that came out of Yaakov, and Zayin Midos, Kol Echad Kulu Miyud Kanoda. That he was really, Yaakov represented to the world of Zah, right? A certain aspect of the world of Atzilus, where he was the Midos of Atzilus, is what Yaakov represented, and therefore he had 70 souls, which is sort of like his expression, which is the 7 Midos, each one inter-included with 10. That's why he had 70. So if you break it down, each one of the people that was connected with Yaakov, his children and their wives and all their children, each one represented a particular Midah, whether it was Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, and within that, Chochmah, Bina, Das, one of the spheros of, and they were all considered like one entity, because this is what Kedusha does. It finds the unique place, how everything is connected with everything else, and binds them all together in one. This is the union of Kedusha. Even though there's so many of them, riboy number of them, 70, nonetheless he called them nefesh because they were all united in their purpose under the one God, and therefore it was a singular language. As we will explain. Whereas Esav, right, so very subtle little hints of all this deep stuff in the Torah. Hayarak shisha nefashos. Esav only went around with 6 children, right? In his clan there were 6 people. Also, he's like literally the twin brother of Yaakov. Just like Yaakov represents the Midos, Esav represents the Midos. That's why he had 6 children, referring to the 6 Midos. But by him it says nefashos, shisha nefashos, plural. Because no matter how many he had, whether it was a big number or a small number, the way he looked at it was that each one was like their own little empire. Each one was not clearly united with the whole, like a body where even though it has many parts, it's still like Adam, one person, and all the parts are connected and working together. Esav saw his clan as this sort of clan-like separate entity. And therefore he referred to them as nefashos in a lashon rabim, in a plurality, which represents again klippa, pirud, HeChaltzu, separation, division. Right. So we see that those two things. Esav says yesh li rav, I have a multiplicity. Esav says sishat nefashos, plural, and Yaakov says the opposite. Yeah.
The fact that it's saying like klippa wants to separate,
right,
and then categorize.
Right. I mean, categorize even is an act towards unification, right? Because separation, if once it gets categorized, then in theory, the categories can come together and make some type of a whole. So I don't even think he's necessarily looking to categorize. He's just looking to separate. The main thing that he's doing is not seeing how all these different parts fuse together as a whole, because you could say Yaakov also had many parts and he was in a state of separateness, but he categorized them all together so that they all sort of bound together. The idea is that there's no categorization, right? It's just simple plurality, like everyone just take their own. It's like it's messy. That's why we're going to see in a second that it comes from the world of Tohu, because it's just messy. Like everyone just like every man for themselves, grab whatever you can,
Rabbi,
Yeah.
So later on when they met, then Esav had 400 men, and then they all left.
Exactly. Exactly. They just dissipated. Right? They weren't like a band. Right?
We should do this.
Later on, there's a whole story with those 400 men that the Alter Rebbe speaks about it in Torah Or. It started off where Avram gave the 400 shekel kesef to Ephron, right? The Chiti to buy the burial of Sarah, and that was like the beginning of sort of transferring some energy from Kedusha into the Klippas. And it was like sort of like a leakage from Avram into the Klippas, right? And then it wound up manifesting as this 400 like horrible men of Esav. Really in its root, it represents these 400 levels of din. And then the whole like story of the Torah is really like to betaken and fix that and categorize it. And later on in Jewish history, it wound up becoming the 400 men of David HaMelech who bound together and were like his team in the desert. Right, and then we sort of switched it over. There's this thing called the 400 worlds of delight, which is sort of like the root ultimately. Just like Avram handed over these things to the Klippas, ultimately this disparate separateness of this level of din, it could get brought back into Kedusha, and when it does, it's David HaMelech. In other words, it's messianic light. But that's only when it is categories. That's when they stopped dissipating and they were gathered back under the kingship. 400, I didn't say that. Dinim, like basically aspects of, it says they're bate dinim, which is basically like 400 levels of courts, of like harsh judgments that, God forbid, a person has to pass through. In any case, going from a state of like uncategorized to categorized, that's sort of the difference between Klippa and Kedusha. And then he says, even though we're talking about Midian, but you see we've like sort of veered this conversation into Esav because we're talking generally about the concept of Klippa. And And he says, "Akenhu b'shorshan b'chinas spheres to tohu." Right, the source of this notion of separate wildness and not being categorized and put together, it comes from their source, as we just said a moment ago, in tohu, shayu b'chinas anfin mispardin. And in the Zohar, the world of tohu is referred to as the world of separated branches, right? Because when you have the trunk, you could see how all the different parts really are united. But when you get sort of lost in the branches, right, you don't necessarily see how one branch is connected to another. It just looks like a melee of craziness, right? And so that's what the world looks like to the average person who's not like united in Kedusha. You don't see like the whole world is this big family of man where everyone has their part. You know, it says, why was there peace on earth in the time of Shlomo HaMelech? Because he was able to basically see the utility and the usefulness of each nation and like how they participated in like the great global family. When you don't have that unifying force, it's just like the jungle, right? Everybody's just trying to grab their part and the stronger survives and there's sort of just a craziness. This comes from lacking insight into how everything is rooted in oneness. And in the Zohar, they call this the separated branches, or the world of Tohu, the world of craziness, right? So, how did this world of Tohu, just as an aside here, how did this sort of get off the ground? Where did, if God is one, everything is one, where did this error arise? We're saying it didn't start with Esav, it didn't start with Midian, right? It started in the source of these entities on earth, which was Tohu. The question I'm asking is, where did it all go wrong with inside of Hashem's unity that suddenly there was like this inability to see unity even inside of godliness itself? How did like Tohu happen? Is the question. If God is one, everything starts as one. How did it all go wrong? Does anyone have an understanding of this in its root?
It broke the vessels. It was too overwhelming.
Okay, so Tohu is a concept of the breaking of the vessels, right? I guess you could say Tohu leads to the breaking of the vessels. What is the idea of the breaking of the vessels? It's exactly what we were just talking about, right? When you have a vessel, that's what I wanted to say before. Not necessarily is categorization wrong, because the vessel itself is a form of categorization. It's when you break the vessel and it can't be held and categorized anymore, that's when it just becomes chaotic. How did the vessel break? So we usually say the light was too strong and the vessels were too weak. But what does that mean? How did that scenario get off the ground? So what world preceded Tohu? Does anyone know?
Tikkun.
No, Tikkun came after Tohu, right? Tohu and then Tikkun. Tikkun is called a rectification because it rectified the broken world of Tohu. What came before Tohu?
There wasn't separation from sheer scale. Before sheer scale.
There was worlds though. Ariel, what world came before Tohu? What is it? Nukudim? Akudim. Very good. Okay, so there's another here. You're introducing another phraseology here, which is important. Remember, it said that it's actually, let's go on his page. He's usually pretty right on. Remember in the story of Yaakov's sheep, where it says that Lavan was cheating him with his different speckled and spotted sheep, and over there the word is used akudim, nikudim, barudim, right? Which is different types of spots and speckles. Akudim comes from the word akeda, which means to bind, right? So it means like a whole bunch of things are bound inside of one vessel. And this is, sometimes we call this world akudim, sometimes we call this world, they're different worlds officially, but they're very much interchangeable when you get into the Chassidic conversation about these things. And this is the world, what we call Adam Kadmon, right? The Primordial Man, which is essentially, we've discussed it before, it's the first world that really took place after the Tzimtzum. Before the Tzimtzum, we also speak about worlds. Those are like the worlds of the Ein Sof, but they're really not, there's no vessels, there's just light and they're just theoretical. When the Tzimtzum happens, and then after the Tzimtzum, there's an empty space, and then there's a re-emergence of this Kav, the first thing that enters and into the empty space and fills it is the first world, which is called Adam Kadmon, right? Now, it's called also Akudim, because the idea of the Adam Kadmon, why is it called bound? Because all the theoretical spheros that will eventually come out and form the 10 spheros, they're all bound in one kli. right? And that's what we mean that there was like, when we talk about the Shviros HaKelim, what was the Kli? It was the one Kli of Adam Kadmon that held all the 10 lights, the 10 Spheros inside of it, right? The thing is that those Spheros and those 10 lights, where did they just come from a moment before, right? They came from before the Tzimtzum, where they were literally infinite, right? So now that those literally infinite lights have been sort of taken their first journey into becoming individuated lights, which are going to be called the lights inside of the vessels of the 10 Spheros, but before they actually come into the 10 Spheros, they're all bound in this one Kli, and therefore they're all really indistinguishable from each other. It's very hard to tell the difference, what's the light of Chokhmah and the light of Chesed, the light of Gevurah, when they're all basically inside of one vessel. What usually gives the lights the ability to be distinct from one another is that they're in a different vessel. And it's almost like a prism, like the vessel allows for the subtlety of the light to shine in a different color, and emanate with a different quality. But if they're only in one vessel, then all the theoretical lights really have no difference between any of them, right? Because there's nothing.
Opposite of Tohu.
That's the opposite of Tohu completely. It's absolute oneness. But because the lights basically have just come out fresh from the Or Ein Sof, which preceded the Tzimtzum, all they know how to be is infinite. They don't really know how to, take their place amongst others, because each one is fresh off of the experience of being the infinite light of God. And therefore, that's what it means the lights were too great and the vessels were too small, right? And this is the answer to our question, where did all of a sudden God get off like being in a state of separateness and lack of unity, right? When all he is unity. And the idea is in his attempt to bring these spheros out, right? It was almost like they were like a young child in adolescence. Like they don't know how to contain their excitement. They just go wild and break, right? So each one of these lights, because it only knew how to be infinite, and you're now trying to contain it and confine it into a particular quality. So it was an infinite chesed, an infinite gevurah, an infinite tiferes. Each one only knew how to be infinite. And when you try and put a bunch of infinite things in one place together, there's nowhere else to go but to shatter. And so it was actually from Hashem's own infinite strength, when you try to then fuse his and funnel his qualities into something finite, and each one only knows how to be infinite. So each finite thing is an infinite finite thing of that flavor, and therefore they all clash with each other, because each one sort of needs to take up the whole space. And therefore this leads to, from akudim, which means a binding of all these lights into one vessel, it leads to the next phase, which is called tohu or nukudim, which means little points. And now little points are such a thing that basically every point thinks that they're independent from every other point, right? They don't know how to see themselves in relationship to the whole. But that's the source of all klippa, but you can actually see that it came from a place of strength. Because they were so unbelievably powerful, therefore, and they had right to be. They were coming straight from God, who's all-powerful. It's just that in this capacity, the individual felt the power of the full-blown infinite God, and the only problem is that when you come into contact with someone else who feels the same way, and therefore everybody sort of has to take up the whole place. In Elokus, this is not such a problem. It's a world called Tohu, which can exist in this place where there's infinite numbers of infinite powers. But if you're trying to make a settled world, this is the opposite of a settled world, and therefore it represents the idea of klippa and the opposite of kedusha. The next phase after that then is going to be called tikkun, or what we call atzilus, or berudim. If you're going in akudim, nakudim, berudim, then the next phase is each sphera sort of was rectified in that it wound up recognizing that it was only one of many. It mellowed out its intensity to have to be infinite in its own right, and therefore was able to take a place amongst the other spheros in a big family, and that's called sort of taking the points and realigning them in some kind of a team. And that's what we call atzilus, and that's what's called tikkun. That is called categorization, which is why I didn't want to put being categorized is not the opposite of kedusha. It's actually the definition of kedusha, right? So you can have a oneness, which is either a level of oneness of akudim, or Adam Kadmon, or you could have a level of oneness, which is a level of Berudim, or Atzilus and Tikkun, right? And the difference between them is the oneness that was found in Akudim was that the individual parts were negated inside of like an infinity. That's what means there's only one Kli, and all the lights were just basically like sort of, they wound up having to trade up their individual identity for just being sort of encloaked inside of this general picture of oneness. So they didn't really show their individual selves. When they did show their individual selves, then they clashed with each other. And then the next level of unity is when the individual self has to be tuned down, and then it can come together and band with the other individuals and form like a team. And this is the idea of Kedusha, Achdus, the unity of the different disparate parts, Yud, Kei, Vav, Kei, etc. Is everyone following all this? Okay, so this is, anyway, how Klippa began in its origin. And this is what we call the separated branches of the world of Tohu. Starting from the third line down here, he says, Sha'amidos de Tohu lo hayecholim lisbol ze et ze. And the idea is that the midos of the world of Tohu could not handle each other for this reason that we said. Each one was charged with like a feeling of infinity that it got from its previous state. The chesed lo hayechol lisbol midos ha-gevura. Chesed couldn't handle gevura. V'chein gevura es midas ha-chesed. And gevura couldn't handle the chesed. V'lechein kesiv behen v'yimloch v'yamas. And that's why, where do we see a hint to the spheros of Tohu in the actual Torah? In the progeny of Esav, where it says they had these tribes that came out of him, called the Elufe Edom, like the masters of Edom. Edom is Esav. It says by them in quick succession that one reigned and died. They reigned and died right after each other, right? I think it's in Parshas Vayishlach. And the idea is that, why do they reign and die? Because as soon as the other one came into the picture, there was no concept of sort of like a peaceful transfer of power. Like the existence of one completely negated the ability for the other one to dominate, for the reason that we said. Each one had to have the whole, or they had nothing, right? It's kind of like the idea of light and darkness. It's like if darkness wants to be complete darkness, then any shred of light is already in complete opposition with it. Right, and if light wants to be pure light, then it has to be completely entirely light. There can't be like a concept of night and then day, because if there's night and then day, then night has to have an end, and where it like allows day to take over. This whole notion of like let there be yom v'layla, that's already like a measure of tikkun, where you give the sun a certain like area to reign, and then the darkness gets an area to reign. This like trading of the guard, which is a participation, a cooperation of some sort. Imagine if neither one wanted to cooperate. You just have like total chaos, where neither the light would let the darkness in, or vice versa. That's why the kav was sort of an original tikkun, if you will. Because first of all, you have the infinite light, then you have the tzimtzum, which is infinite darkness, and the kav was the beginning of what we call tiferes, or like a blend, where you have a line of light. If you have a line of light, that means you already have some kind of a cooperation where the darkness and the light say, you know what, let's share. I'll take a line, you take the rest, and like we'll coexist. So this is the opposite of the attitude of Tohu, where the opposite midos could not withstand each other at all. Kiyadua. And this is why this shattering of the vessels took place. You try and fill a cup entirely to the top with one liquid, with wine, and then that same cup, you're going to fill it entirely with oil, you're not going to wind up with either. You're going to shatter the vessel. And this is exactly what happened to sort of like the nature of creation at that level. Whatever vessel was trying to hold godliness, it couldn't hold such infinite opposing powers, and therefore it shattered. And that was the spawning of what would eventually become Klippa and the other side. In other words, I said a moment ago that in the world of Tohu, it's not really such a problem to have conflicting infinite powers, because God can contain them all. He's not like bothered by that. Because at the end of the day, they are Hashem's own midos, and He can be infinitely chesed and infinitely gevur at the same time. He can be completely bright and completely dark at the same time. He's God. He can bear opposites. The problem is when you're going to try to express that in a world, right? So when that quality of tohu tries to come and express itself in any kind of a contained world, it shows itself as the need to overcome your boundary, to basically break all boundaries, and therefore to be selfish and to take over somebody else's part of the line. So the attitude of the world of Tohu, when it exports itself into any other world, it becomes klippa, i.e. the inability to participate nicely and cooperate. It's the idea of like the jungle, where each entity has a klippa philosophy, therefore it's Esav, Yeshli Rav, I want more, I want yours, I want mine, I want more of yours, because it doesn't know how to basically self-contain, which is a tikkun type of approach to be put into the world. V'zeh inin klippas midyan. Now in general, this is what we call the klippa of Midian. Even though we're saying all of the Sitra Achra and all of klippa works this way, the name for that disease of the inability to sort of come together and recognize where I end and where you begin, that has a name for it, right? And that actually had a certain nation that manifested like the sick, foul thing that is, and it was called Midian. There was a reason why we had to like obliterate every single one of them, because when that existed in the world as a manifest nation, it was like pure evil in the world. And this gets us back to our previous conversation, why Moshe specifically had to be the one to take them out. Right, and why it completed Moshe's soul, because of the intensity of the foulness of what they represent, which is again madon v'riv b'chinas piru. It's literally the literal definition of the inability to come together, which is what tohu in essence represents. Shezeu masha nafal b'shvira michlalos inyan tohu. Shahayu amidos bechinas pirut, and he's getting into like a subtle concept over here. If all klippa has the inability to connect, that's the definition of it. So what exactly is Midian? He wants to say that Tohu has what's called klal and prat. There's the general concept of what's the common denominator, even though the common denominator is to not have anything in common, but the common denominator of Tohu, and then there's the individual fallout of each like piece sort of being a victim of that common denominator. So what we're saying is that Midian was the common denominator. What all of Tohu had in common is this notion that they couldn't get along with each other. Now, Chesed doesn't get along in a different way than Gevurah doesn't get along. And Tiferes doesn't get along in a different way than Netzach doesn't get along. So they had different qualities of Tohu. But the one thing they all had in common is the inability to get together. That each one had to be ruling the whole and taking up all the space. And that general concept fell from Tohu, just like the individual parts fell from Tohu. And that's what became Midian. And this is the reason why Midian was not one of the 7 nations. Remember we said that we didn't go and conquer them. They weren't one of the 7 nations that we had to come and conquer. And that was one of the questions. Why do we even have to like deal with them? They weren't like really part of our journey towards conquest. And the idea is because they were sort of outside of any of the individual issues. They were the general issue. They were like the thing that all of Tohu had in common, just disagreement and inability to get together. And that itself manifested not as an individual one of the 7 nations, but as its own like private entity that was just like this giant beast of general Tohu problem. The Zayin Umos, Kanani, Achiti, all the individual 7 nations that we had to conquer, Hem Ba'zayin Midos Pratios, they represent the like Chesed of Tohu, Gevura of Tohu. Kol echad b'mida pratis to Tohu. Each one was literally an actual midah. And he says some of them. Canaan was Chesed, the Chiti was Gevura. All that's written in Sefer Kehilos Yaakov, he says. The kol echad who klippa prati b'mida prati to Tohu. Each one of the 7 midos was a particular midah of Tohu that like sort of settled into the land and manifest that particular issue. So for example, what does it mean for Chesed to not know any boundaries? That's the idea, for example, like I was saying before, that the light doesn't want to give any room for any darkness, right? Or what's the, like, or in I guess in another way, Chesed is the idea, we talk sometimes about Chesed of Yishmael, right? Where he was also representative of Chesed of Klippa. And what was his problem? He was the Indian of 9 parts znus. He had this problem of sexual overstepping his bounds, right? Yishmael. Sexual impropriety, so rape and incest and all these things. So what is that? That's basically a quality of love, but it's a love that doesn't know when to stop, right? And a love that just says anything is mine, right? So it's, and then you have Gevura. Gevura, let's say, is Esav, is considered like a Gevura of Klippa. So what is that? It's that strictness and discipline has a place. But it has to know when it ends. If you're going to be so strict and so disciplined that anyone who raises an eyebrow the wrong way, you're going to cut his head off. So you're allowing your midah to overstep its bounds. So when klippa doesn't know when to stop, it just like takes its midah to the extreme impropriety end. So this is what's called the particular evil of that particular midah. But what do both those two things have in common? The inability to know when to stop. The inability, like the need to not unite with the other one and say, okay, you end here and I'll start here. That participation, that balance. So they're just the extremes of needing to be infinitely divided from each other. That had its own nation, right? It wasn't the Chiti and the Kanani where they were like a Chesed or a Gevura type Klippa. It was the general fervor of just the inability to get along that had its own nation. And it was Midian. It was the general concept of Tohu, not the particulars of Tohu. And this is even worse, right? Because all of them are only derivatives of Midian. So that's what I'm saying. Midian is something like horrible and foul. And unfortunately, even though we killed all the Midians, we still have all these klippas inside of ourselves. The eternal conquest of the land is the job of every Jew throughout all generations to conquer our own animal soul. So before you're going to get busy with your Chiti and your Kanani and your Yevusi, which are all your individual evil midos, you have to realize that they're all derivatives from some general Midian inside of yourself, which is just the simple concept of the inability of coming together. And what we're going to call this is called Sinas China. And this is why the temple has not yet been built, because no one thinks they have that, right? Even if people are aware of their negativity, they're going to always focus on the detailed part of what midah they're trying to fix. And they don't even realize that there's something beyond that that precedes that, which is, why do I have bad midos in the first place? It's because I have a Midian inside of me, which is the general evil of the world of Tohu, the general evil of the Sitra Achra. And that's what we're saying. Kol echad, each one is a klippa prati of Tohu, which corresponds to a particular clip of Kedusha. However, klippas Midian, einu midah pratis. Midian is not one of the 7. Ki michlalos inyana Tohu. It represents Tohu at large, as we said. Shu inyana pirud, which is, what is Tohu at large? What do they all have in common? The inability to have anything in common. Separation. That's the rule. Shezeu haklal shaya bechlalos hatohu. And this is the general rule of Tohu. Shaya bechinas unfinished part. Like we said, separated branches. Just the inability to see how we all come from one trunk. I just see myself as like living in a jungle, totally disconnected from you. My life is my life. Right? Like it says in Pirkei Avos last week. It says, Shali, Shali, v'shalach, shalach. So yesh omrim, that this is midos beinanu. Some people say, oh, it's not so bad, right? At least you're not saying that what's mine is yours. No, it says, no, yesh omrim ze midos sdom. It's the worst thing, right? It's like what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. It looks like it's like a midah of a Beinani, and maybe that's what it means. Like every Beinani has to fight with this thing. Then it comes and says this is the midah of Sodom, the most cruel, wicked, disgusting nation that ever lived on the earth. What was their thing? What's yours is yours and what's mine is mine. Why is that so bad? It seems like it's practically not like practical, and the answer is because we don't see that we're unified. That what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours might be true in a basic sense, so that we can categorize ourselves and realize how we come together in a cloud. But if you think that you're just a branch over there and I'm a branch over here, and we're unaware of the fact that we're branching out from a common trunk, we're in major trouble, right? We've like completely lost the plot. This is going to lead to Sodom.
So you have to have both. You have to have what's mine is mine, yours is yours, and also the realization that we come from a unified whole.
True, because if you don't realize, if you just say that, like, you know what's like first thing it says is what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. This is that's an Amma Aretz, right? If you think that there's no boundaries, you're just an idiot, right? But at the same time, there is a level where there's no boundaries, which is Kedusha, and that's what we said before, that's called Adam Kadmon, where like any distinctions have not yet come out, because it's like really before you're born, you don't have an individual self yet. There's unity at such a level. But that's not necessarily the type of unity that Hashem wants for His world, because that's beyond the world, right? It's like such a level of it's like an infant who doesn't even know that he exists yet. So he's for sure not getting in any fights with the infant in the crib next door. It's when he starts to have a feeling of self and personality, that's when the positive and the negative starts. Now he can say what's mine is mine, right? Because he knows who he is. But then there's this adolescent type of quality where he thinks the whole world is his. Because all he knows is like I. He just come to the realization I. And at the same time, he just came from a place where there was nothing. So now his I is everything. Right? He thinks he has the whole thing. So it takes time to develop, to mature, to realize that someone else also has an I. And that both eyes together is a we, right? And yeah, this is ultimate unity. You have to really know who you are, and then you have to know your place. But it's not an easy thing. It's so difficult is it that we're still sitting in a world of sinas chinam, which is the reason that there's no Beis HaMikdash standing. If we could just get this simple thing, we'd have a Beis HaMikdash. We'd all have achdus. We'd all have unity. We'd have Mashiach. We could recognize our place. Right? And the importance of everybody else, the importance of ourselves. We can't seem to put this thing together. And that's what we said in the beginning. Knowing is half the battle. Right? Just knowing about the reality of your corrupted self is the only way, even in a million years, to even begin to fix this problem. And that's what we're saying. Everybody's busy fixing their midos. And they don't even realize that the fact that they have broken midos comes from a precursor to that, which is a philosophy of Midian, which they don't even know about. And therefore, no matter how much they fix, it's like on quicksand, it just keeps coming back.
So it's almost like psychology. Like
it's a lot psychology.
A person is trying to fix their midos, but they have something in their past that they forgot about.
Right, and if they don't get to that point, those midos are going to just keep manifesting in other and uncomfortable ways. They're never going to get rid of it. They're going to just keep banging their head against the wall. Why can't I fix myself? And it's because they're not looking in the right place. They're looking at the detail of Midian, of Tohu. They need to look at the klal of Tohu. What's wrong here in the first place? Okay, so he says this is the idea of the separated branches. V'zos haisa sibas hashvira. This is why everything broke in Tohu. Mashnishtalshlu hazayin midus ras. And why the 7 evil midos came out in the first place. Hu mitzara piruch ayabatohu. It's because of the separation philosophy that was inside of Tohu. The inability to see everything as a unity. The lacking of recognizing the trunk. Shezeu asiba klalis the shvira the kelim the Tohu. That was the general reason for the general breaking of Tohu. It's not just because Chesed had to have things her way, or Gevurah had to have things his way. There was something before the individual problem. It was just the fact that everybody had to have things their way, right? That there was a need to dominate all and not see the place for anybody else. That problem each one shared in their own unique light. And that unique quality came down and manifested below in this nation called Midian. That's why they were such stinkers. They weren't part of the 7 nations. Because they weren't one of the individual midos. They were all of Tohu, which is the pirud, the notion of separation, which is the source of the shvira to begin with. Kitzer, Klippas Midian, Inyanam Madon, Basinas Chinam, Zayin Umos, Zayin Midos Pratius. So Klippas Midian is generally this notion of baseless hatred, whereas the 7 nations, they represent the individual qualities of hate. In other words, you could say based hatred, right? Once you get into the individual, now your evil midos are coming out because of you have a certain reason. I want to love, and you're standing in my way of loving the way I want to love. But it's already you're opposing me with some with some rationale behind it, and therefore my opposition to you has a reason behind it. It's hatred. It's still overcoming my boundaries, but but there's seichel to it. What precedes that is just an irrational need to divide, not for any reason, because my inyan is tohu. And that's called baseless hatred, right? That's already there is nothing behind my need to not be united with you. It's completely irrational. It's just an evil seed inside of myself called Midian, which you don't have to do anything to me in order to arouse that. It's built into my corrupted character, which I have to go back and find.
You're always like, the median means strife, so you're just always ready to fight.
Always ready to be in strife, and you don't require a reason. All right, we'll get more to it tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
how do you distinguish between Midian and Esau?